Good afternoon and welcome to this press conference at the Palais des Nations in Geneva. We are pleased to have with us the group of human rights experts on Nicaragua who will present their first report as mandated by the UN Human Rights Council. We are pleased to have with us Jan Simon, who's the chair of the group of human rights experts on Nicaragua, and Mr. Simon is senior researcher at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Crime, Security and Law in Freiburg, Germany, as well as Angela Buitrago, who's the other expert of the group. And she's a professor in criminal law, procedural law, and human rights at Universidad Externado de Colombia in the capital city of Bogota. On 31st of March, the Human Rights Council established the group of human rights experts on Nicaragua to conduct thorough and independent investigation into all alleged human rights violations and abuses committed in the country since April 2018. On 24th of May of last year, the previous president of the council, Federico Villegas, appointed the members of the group of experts, and the Human Rights Council requested the group of human rights experts on Nicaragua to submit a report to the council at its 52nd session during an interactive dialogue that is scheduled to take place this coming Monday, 6th of March. So this report has been released. You should all have received it, and it should be on the group of experts page anytime soon. If you haven't received the report, please let us know. We'll be happy to share it with you. So here is the scenario for this press conference, in which simultaneous interpretation in English and Spanish will be provided. First, the chair of the group of experts, Mr. Jan Simon, will deliver opening remarks in English, and after that, both Mr. Simon and Ms. Buitrago will take your questions. So without further ado, Mr. Simon, you have the floor.
Good afternoon to all. Angela Buitrago, also a member of the group of human rights experts on Nicaragua, joins me today in this press conference. The group of experts on Nicaragua, established in accordance with the resolution 49/3 of the Human Rights Council, is pleased to present the findings of the investigations we have carried out over the past year. In accordance with the mandate to us by the Council, we have investigated alleged human rights violations and abuses committed in Nicaragua since April 2018. For the purpose of this investigation, the group of experts wrote to the state of Nicaragua on 12 occasions requesting official information and exchange of views on the issues covered by the mandate. No response was received to any of these requests. Access was not provided to the group to visit the territory of Nicaragua. This report was also shared with the authorities before the publication, to be concrete on the 22nd of February, also without having received any comments. The findings of the group are based on the review of available documents, legislation, and policies. The group also conducted almost 300 interviews with former officials, victims, civil society organizations, and other stakeholders. As access was not provided to Nicaragua, missions were carried out to areas near Nicaraguan territory, as well as other locations where many Nicaraguans now live outside the country. A substantial number of the interviews were with persons who had left Nicaragua less than a year ago. So this is more recent information that has been processed, that was gathered on the ground. Based on this investigation, we can conclude that widespread and systematic human rights violations that amount to crimes against humanity and are motivated by political reasons have been committed against civilians by the Nicaraguan government since 2018. These violations continue to be committed today. The violations include extrajudicial executions, arbitrary detentions, torture, arbitrary deprivation of nationality, and violations of the right to remain in one's own country. They are not isolated incidents, but the product of the deliberate dismantling of democratic institutions and destruction of civic and democratic space. These violations and abuses are being perpetrated in a widespread and systematic manner for political reasons, constituting the crimes against humanity of murder, imprisonment, torture, including sexual violence, deportation, and persecution on political grounds. The group concluded that President Daniel Ortega and Vice President Rosario Murillo have put into practice patterns of these crimes and continue to do so as of the date of this report. The report identifies a pattern of extrajudicial executions carried out by agents of the national police and members of pro-government armed groups who acted in a joint and coordinated manner during protests that took place between the 18th of April and the 23rd of September 2018. The government obstructed the investigations regarding these and other deaths. The report also indicates that agents of the police and the prison administration, members of pro-government armed groups, committed acts of physical and psychological torture, including sexual and gender-based violence, in the context of the apprehension, interrogation, and detention of opponents. In addition, the group found that the authorities have used arbitrary detention as a tool to silence critics. Many arrests were characterized by excessive use of force by the police and violence at the hands of pro-government armed groups. Many people were detained without warrants and held incommunicado. The group has concluded that all these actions are possible because the state apparatus in its entirety has been used as a weapon of persecution against the population. High-level authorities have managed to instrumentalize executive, legislative, judicial, and electoral branches to develop and implement a legal framework aimed at repressing the exercise of fundamental freedoms and persecuting opposing persons or those perceived to be opposing. The objective is to eliminate, by different means, any opposing or dissenting voices in the country. And this has resulted in the Nicaraguan population living in fear and in terror of the actions that the government may take against them. Thousands of human rights defenders, members of civil society, activists, journalists, student leaders, religious figures, and artists, as well as the main national and territorial leaders of the political opposition, were forced to leave the country. Since 2018 December, at least 3,144 civil society organizations have been shut down. Virtually all independent media and human rights organizations operate today from abroad. And the situation continues to worsen. In February 2023, Nicaraguan authorities deprived 222 individuals who were imprisoned at that time of their nationality and expelled them from the country. They were accused of being traitors to the homeland. Also last month, the Court of Appeals of Managua declared another 94 persons residing in Nicaragua and abroad traitors to the homeland, decreeing their loss of nationality and ordering the confiscation of their assets in favor of the state. The statelessness of those imprisoned for their political views or human rights activists reminds us of dark periods of world history and denotes the extreme actions the authorities have gone in the persecution of opponents. The violations, abuses, and crimes investigated by the group and described in the report give rise to the responsibility of the state of Nicaragua. They also give rise to individual criminal responsibilities, either under international criminal law or in accordance with criminal law definitions in Nicaraguan or even third country legislation. We call on the government to immediately release all persons arbitrarily deprived of their liberty, cease violations, abuses and crimes, particularly persecution on politically motivated grounds, and undertake exhaustive, independent, and transparent investigations of documented violations, abuses, and crimes to hold those perpetrators accountable. We also make a very strong call to the international community to initiate legal actions against the individuals responsible for the documented violations and extend sanctions to institutions and individuals involved in the commission of violations and crimes under international law. In the negotiation of development cooperation and investment projects in Nicaragua, we recommend that governments and multilateral organizations include human rights safeguards and prioritize actions aimed at improving the situation in Nicaragua. The report we present fulfills the mandate we have been given, including by establishing recommendations going forward. It is also a call both to national authorities and to the international community to act without delay. Thousands of victims, many now in the diaspora, hundreds of them stateless, demand accountability and justice. This call needs to be heard and acted upon by the international community and by the Council. This call needs to be heard and really put into action. It is our sincere hope that this report can also contribute to preventing the further spiraling of systemic violations and abuses in Nicaragua. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Simon. We're first going to take questions from the room and then from Zoom. So, yes, Gabriela Sotomayor.
Thank you. Gabriela Sotomayor, Mexico Proceso. My question is on the accountability. What is next? What are the steps that you expect that the international community should take? And what do you expect at national level as well? Thank you.
Yeah. Gracias.
Thank you, Gabriela, for your question. Well, the first thing we ought to say is that the group understands that there are two levels of responsibility. First, there is a responsibility that means to search for the implementation of universal jurisdiction. And this means that any country should then be able to investigate such facts. And the second has to do with the issue of passive inquiries. And that means that we also have cases in which there are people with dual nationality who were subjected to such grave violations. And this ought to be activated by their own countries, as we have seen that there are French citizens, US citizens, as well as people of other nationalities, and these states could exercise jurisdiction. From that point of view, the call of the group, and particularly on the basis of our findings, generates the necessity, as Jan has said, to make a call to action for the principle of protection. And the principle of protection means that we are able to ask that the community, which is obligated to try and prevent such crimes against humanity, must act unofficially through these elements. But it is also important to highlight that Argentina, for instance, has started an inquiry in which they were able to implement universal jurisdiction. And from that point of view, we already have a first attempt in Argentina for the inquiry and judging of such crimes. And therefore, the paths are numerous. And based on this, we raise a call to the international community in face of the obligation to avoid such crimes for each of you to exercise, to take action in your own jurisdiction for legal action. And there is also, of course, a state responsibility. And therefore, we would say that there are two components: the component of the state responsibility, and the second one is the criminal individual responsibility of people who have enacted, participated, decided, or who intervened in such acts of violence. Thank you, Gabriela.
Agency.
Sí. Muchas gracias. Isabel Saco para la agencia F.
Isabel Saco from the Saco Agency. I have two questions. The first question is, in the report, it doesn't seem like the role of armed forces of the army is clearly established in the inaction of the acts that are being denounced. And so in that sense, I'd like to know whether it is possible that armed forces are kept on the margin of governmental action, or what specific roles are they having, since we understand that if the current government is still acting this way, it's because they do have the support of armed forces. And the second question, in a more general way, what hope is left for the people of Nicaragua while the couple Ortega Murillo are still in power?
Cosas. Lo primero, nosotros tenemos.
Well, first of all, we have proof. Well, first of all, we have proof of the participation of the police with a pro-governmental group, in which it is clear that that they intervene in extrajudicial execution, as well as arbitrary detentions, and including in violent inactions against the Nicaraguan population. And from that point of view, we can see that this is something that has been created a long time ago, and it was a legal transformation which has led that through a law in particular, they were able to consolidate power and the power and the rule of the President of the Republic, and in its relation with the police. And this is an issue that we know from how in the region, and in how slowly these institutions became within the dynamic, the issue of control and coordination was done coordinated. And this is the answer to the first question, and this has to do with the participation of the Nicaraguan police. and of the pro-governmental group, and this is very important. These pro-governmental group have a number of origins. These pro-governmental group are people who are sometimes retired from the police, people who are part of the system, close to the presidential system, and people who are gathering based on specific calls and who are acting jointly in regards to the repression and also in regards to the use of firearms towards the civil population. And this is what the report has demonstrated, how the role of the army as an armed force. And we have a specific inquiry, a lateral inquiry, and we see that it is the police who manages the greatest part of the actions. And about the second question about whether it is the president supported by armed forces, I think that with the confirmation that all institutions have instrumentalized the power, it is an element that can lead us to conclude clearly in regards to the participation of all entities jointly. We believe it is a system that has definitely been built in that was planned as for institutions to lead a hand to the construction and maintenance of power and the control that they are trying to exercise in Nicaragua by the president and by the structures that were built to support him.
The Nicaraguan state, in fact, has been weaponizing literally all institutions of the state in terms of control and repression. And the word here is weaponizing. They have been weaponizing the justice system, weaponizing the legislative function, weaponizing the executive function of the state against the population. And as to what extent very specific institution like the army would be involved in this is to the extent that it is complementary to the strategy of weaponizing the state institutions, which is a typical role played in circumstances where you have a complete disjunction of all separation of powers in a state. We are very concerned of the present situation because the elements of cruelty and the elements of taking hostage the whole population, even as bargaining chips for different aspects of complex situations that might come up for the government of Nicaragua, will get the situation even worse. The international community should be aware of having further deterioration of the situation up to a humanitarian crisis. And this is what we are discussing also with member states on the bilateral level at present.
Thank you. Emma Farge from AP, please.
That's my competitor.
Sorry.
No problem. I was just wondering if you could give us an idea of the scale of the crimes against humanity. You talk about a segment of the population, but can you say if you're talking about thousands of people or tens of thousands of people? And secondly, can you tell us more about the reaction of the government to your inquiries? And have they seen the report and have they responded? Thank you.
Conclusions on crimes against humanity, there's always an issue of scale in the argument, though there is no quantitative threshold in order to come to the conclusions that we come, given the wide angle of human rights violations that have been committed here, and given the very specific conclusion on political persecution, which is a subjective element in crimes against humanity that can be targeted anyone in the population that comes under the scheme of enemy and friends in terms of political differentiation between who's against me and who is in favor of me. It's just a scale of thousands and ever thousands. Yes. So the scale we're looking at is in terms of executions, which is the legal term in crimes against humanity, murder. It is more than 100. If it comes to torture, we would come to several hundred, even more. And if it comes to arbitrary detentions, this goes well beyond this number. And given then the other violations detected under political persecution, several thousands.
Thank you.
Second
Madam-
question, sorry, I forgot it.
Just how the government has reacted to your...
Government has reacted. I think it is very important to remind us that the first reaction of the government the day we were appointed is that the government sent a letter to the President of the Council with copy to the Secretary General of the UN saying that this group doesn't exist and they would not accept any mandate of the Council in this context. This is why the government wouldn't respond to our 12 letters of inquiry and asking them for cooperation. We shared the report on the 22nd and we wouldn't get any answer to.
Thank you. Madam, if you could please introduce yourself. Yeah, first.
In regards to the issue of numbers, I feel it is important to take into account the issue of constant threat towards the Nicaraguan population, the risk of being called traitors, of being defined as traitors. And this increases the number that we've been able to verify in terms of deportation and displacement, and also the constant threat that the Nicaraguan population has to be defined as traitors, and to see their nationality removed and to be deported from their own territory. In concrete terms, if we could have an approximation in terms of numbers, if there is a number that is corroborated by a number of other elements, is that in terms of extrajudicial execution, tortures, and preventive detentions, there is a unlimited number of elements that are of people that have been threatened. But this threat can constitute the threat actually stands on all the Nicaraguan people in regards to persecution and realities in terms of in the face of those grave violations. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm Leticia Gaitan, journalist for 100% Noticia in Nicaragua. In the report, you're mentioning that you weren't able to determine the individual responsibility in regards to this action. We also know that your mandate is almost coming to an end. Should the Council extend your mandate, will you be able to then determine such criminal responsibilities in order to allow other countries to start inquiries? How could this happen? How can countries follow up with judicial matters if you haven't identified legal responsibility, criminal responsibility? And the second question is, what do you say about people who have lost their nationality and who are still at risk? Well, the question of deepening the inquiry and the report is already part of the determination of a number of structures and numbers. And what it's clear is that we know who the people in charge and responsible are, and we know about the structure. And we have some indication by part of these numbers and part of these people, but we also would like to have the security that they are that we are indeed able to name everyone who is part of such structures in order to be able to truly speak about individual criminal accountability. And the criminal responsibility is individual, and therefore it is important that we have greater details about some of the stakeholders, some of the actors, and we are aware of some names who will not be released in the report because we are clear about what the structure is, and we need to gather additional information about presumed perpetrators. And the second part, which has to do with accountability, as you said rightly, the mandate is about to end. But if you read the report, there are a number of data that are able to lead to the clear action and the legal proceedings and precise involvement. And if we look at the question of the exercise of jurisdiction, this allows, through the proofs that are already available, the proof that was produced with the authorization of victims by the group of experts, these have enough elements in order to allow for verification and therefore the responsibility of the of individuals. In the case of the bishop, the question of persecution, as Jan said at the beginning, this is done on the basis of the components of political determination or opposition or suspected opposition. And the question of the Catholic Church is a matter that we need to evaluate very specifically in regards to the persecutions that have occurred lately within the church, and on the basis of detention, which, if analyzed, can show that there are other members of the cleric who have also been detained, and it is about taking into account some elements which are not coherent in regards to the charges and the facts. And this is something that we're trying to deepen, we're trying to evaluate, but it is part of this matter, and the fact that detention and the lack of correlation between the charges and the facts, and the state has said that the charges were enough and that there is no right for defense, and on this basis we are moving forward with this analysis, which needs to be deepened because the facts occurred after 2018. And as you know, the matter of church was heard more strongly last year.
To you, Gabriel. If you wish to hear the questions from the journalists participating remotely, please use your headsets. Julio Conto Ortiz from Deutsche Welle, please.
¿Me escuchan?
Can hear you.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity. I'd like to go back to the question of the criminal inquiry that was mentioned by the speakers, because you have perfectly summarized the fact that you have not had access to the country, that cooperation was rejected, and Nicaragua never was signatory to the Rome Statute, and therefore criminal investigation by the Criminal International Court doesn't seem viable or a possibility. So how would this criminal investigation take place, and how would this potential judgment take place? Would be a judgment without the being present, or would it happen abroad? Thank you very much for your question. Well, first of all, we'd like to take advantage
Informarles que la base jurídica
of this opportunity to tell you that the legal basis upon which we have reached our conclusions is based on what in international law is called criminal international common law, and this is the practice that is used within the United Nations and based on the resolution of the Security Council in this regard, as well as it was also used in Rwanda, as well as in ex-Yugoslavia, or a number of other spaces such as Sierra Leone, as well as other jurisprudence who are linked to these the common law and these norms, and therefore we are reaching this conclusion based on pretty steady norms and precedents.
Bajo este aspecto
In terms of the jurisdictions that can reach such conclusion, with the great majority of the jurisdictional links, the majority of countries who have ratified the Rome Status have a minimum common basis in regards to the Article 7 of this status, which is a sufficient basis to allow to bring to judgment with if the universal jurisdiction is applied, and in order to judge the conducts that were detected by this group. And in regards to the evidence, and the evidence, particularly in this case, are evidence that need to be collected on the crime scene, and there are many cases where evidence is collected through testimonies, through forensic evidence, and through documents.
Lo manejamos de una u otra forma como grupo y lo hemos
And this is something that we've highlighted as a group.
Suelen procesar en la medida de lo posible con los recursos muy reducidos que tenemos para poder al menos llegar en cuanto al umbral probatorio que nosotros aplicamos, generar material para que una fiscalía empiece a investigar y o incluso en algunos casos podría hasta llegar al umbral probatorio para emitir una orden de captura internacional.
Muchas gracias. Other questions? A question from Zoom. Paula Dupras Dobias, if you can please unmute the mic.
Yes, thank you for taking my questions. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the witnesses that you, the people that you interviewed. You said that they were in neighboring countries. I assume that there were probably many of them in Costa Rica. Wanted to know, were there maybe whether there were any issues regarding their safety. And then also, I read in the reports that on a number of occasions you said that women in particular were specifically vulnerable to some of the abuses that you listed. And then finally, I mean, what sort of reaction do you expect in the council as well as the whole to this report?
Y queremos contarles que el informe
The report has a gender perspective. So, of course, we've been looking at these aspects based on the collecting information in terms of what a violation means in these sensitive cases. The violence is very specific, and we have collected information about preventive detentions, where we have information about the violence against women, and based on these elements we also show something that we would like to reinforce in our report, which is the need to examine how we can solve, from the point of view of the victims, all the violence that they are having against them, and also member states should have the need to take action against some actions that should be eradicated, rape, for example, or asking people to get naked, or even we have a case where a person was detained, a girl was in prison, in men's prison. She was the only woman, so she was deprived of all personal and procedural rights. So what we expect from the assembly, it's that they understand that the extent of the attacks and violations is not only in terms of the elements that we mentioned, but also it affects greatly the protection of gender as a whole. We believe that this is key, and the mandate in particular indicated the need to further analyze with a gender perspective so that we could come up with solutions in these themes from member states.
Of witness and victim protection.
En lo que se refiere a las
One of the main concerns we have at present is given the current situation in Nicaragua, it is more than possible that the government would retaliate against those being identified as sources of this report, and even worse, given the situation that the government is widening its violence and retaliative acts against family members of those supposedly being opposed or doing acts that are conform with the government. We would like to address this as one of the big concerns we have, and that the international community should be aware of, that there might be retaliative acts by the government. This, in particular, in the last weeks, and the acts of the government in the last weeks made it necessary that we would anonymize most of the information of this report because of the concerns we have of retaliative acts of the government.
Thank you. Another question from Gabriela Sotomayor, please.
Gracias. Mencionaba el caso de Argentina, que ya tomó acciones, pero ¿qué esperan particularmente de América Latina, de los países de América Latina? ¿Cuál es su expectativa de ellos? Que sigan los pasos de Argentina quizá, pero ¿qué tan rápido, qué tan pronto puede ser? Y después usted mencionaba que esto le recuerda algunos de los pasajes más oscuros de la historia, pero la historia ha tenido muchos pasajes muy oscuros, pero si pudiera elaborar un poco sobre esa idea, por favor. Gracias.
Perhaps I will answer to the second question, and my colleague will answer the first. Obviously, the parallels are, I'm referring to the year 30s and 40s of the past century, all elements which can be read in the case of Nicaragua are unfortunately also seen in the Nuremberg cases, both in the criminal tribunal against major war criminals as well as judgments under the control law number 10, particularly Article 6C.
The case of, which is called the justice case. Muchos de esos elementos.
Many of these elements appear in the playbooks of repressive regimes of similar to that we are seeing now and are repeated throughout history. And the update that we'll see in regards to Nicaragua is a very serious case which we had not seen for a long time in Central America. following the La Paz case in the region in the 90s.
Y quizás para
And also, in order to answer the first question, I would say that what we expect of countries is that, as Argentina did, that these countries also have the duty to protect neighboring communities, but also, without any doubt, what can to look into, to consider the effects that this type of actions can have on the regions. There is an issue of great concern for us is the humanitarian crisis that may emerge in the region following such mechanisms, because obviously, generating such decisions has led to a major crossing of the borders, which also place Nicaraguans at risk, but also weakens people in other countries, and also these displacements are also creating suffering. The displaced people are also made very vulnerable, and people are confronted to new types of violences once they cross borders. And this has led us to understand that the region has the responsibility to the principle of protection to activate their own legal system in order to protect the population from grave crimes, particularly crimes against humanity. And we believe that following the reception of the information, we've seen how systematically and how mainstream such crimes are. And another phenomenon which is very important and which I think we need to take into account, and that could help countries to look towards the future, is the question of the planification and the construction of a system, and which has generated persecution effects in regards to the Nicaraguan population and also in regards to non-Nicaraguan population. As we said, there are people with other nationalities who live in Nicaragua and who have been subjected to loss of nationality, passport cancellation, and immediate deportation. And therefore, all of this has to be taken into account in regards to the effects and to what may occur within the region and what this type of system can create throughout the region.
More questions from the room or from Zoom? Before we conclude this press conference, Mr. Simon, Ms. Buitrago, is there anything you would like to add before we... No? Okay. Well, thank you very much for attending this press conference, and thank you very much, Mr. Simon and Ms. Buitrago, for presenting your report, your first report to the press here in Geneva. As I mentioned earlier, this report is now public. It's on the Group of Experts webpage. And don't forget that there are 2 meetings dedicated to Nicaragua during this 52nd session. Tomorrow morning, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, will present his oral update. And on Monday, the group of human rights experts on Nicaragua will present their first report officially before the Council. So thank you very much, and have a good day. Thank you.